Friends, here we go. Kinesiology 230. This is chapter 2. This is presentation number 6. We're talking now about the respiratory system, which is part of the whole cardiorespiratory process of being able to circulate blood and also provide oxygen to the muscles and take waste products away from the muscles to be serviced by our bodies, particularly the lungs in terms of oxygen exchange and CO2 exchange. So without any more further ado, let's get into this and get it done. With the structure itself, you have this process, and I know you're going to see this somewhere else. You have air is brought in through the nose and nasal cavities, holy smokes, down through the trachea, into the bronchia, the bronchioles, lungs, alveoli, and then that's where the exchange happens with the blood. So everything we just talked about over the last couple of presentations, where you had the heart sends deoxygenated blood to the lungs. In the actual lungs themselves, both right and left, you have an oxygen exchange that happens at the alveoli level where CO2 is dumped off. We blow that off. Oxygen that we pull in is loaded onto or into the blood. It's sent back to the heart via the pulmonary, that's right, veins, nice job, to where it goes to the left side of the heart to be squished out to the body. Again, for the red line to make its way all the way back to the blue line to be sent to the lungs again. So what we're seeing is the second part of this process. But the big thing that you'll have is the book will ask this in a test question somewhere else. I know you're going to be asked this if you do other coursework. What is this process? Air comes in, it goes through here, it goes through here, it goes through here, it goes through this, goes to the lungs at the alveoli where the gas exchange occurs. And then, you'll have to put this in correct order. Now, the purpose of going through the nose and the nasal cavities, holy smokes, is to warm the air, humidify it, and also purify it, right? So you're not inhaling a bunch of particulates down to your lungs. And the lungs themselves, there's two of them. So when you actually inhale, air comes down, excuse me, and it bifurcates. It goes from one side to the other. It separates. It's not like we do CO2 on one side and oxygen on the other. That happens on both sides. We have oxygen exchange and CO2 exchange. We have oxygen and CO2 exchange. And then the deoxygenated, or the CO2, if you will, is exhaled out after the gas exchange. Now, the mechanics of this, require a couple things to happen. And the active process includes the diaphragm. And the diaphragm, when it contracts, and this usually throws people off too, it's over here, it's represented in this, the diaphragm kind of sits in a relaxed state. Think of it just like a balloon. And when the diaphragm contracts, it pushes up on the lungs. Now, the lungs themselves are basically a couple bags of air, right? And so the pressure that you have, it pushes and it changes the pressure gradient. And as a result, the relaxation of the diaphragm, allows for the process for air to come in and out at rest due to a pressure gradient with the ambient or outside air pressure. And the exhale that you have is a passive response. So this is active. And that could be very much a passive response when I exhale. And it's a matter of, it's diaphragmatic, meaning that comes from the diaphragm, but also from a muscular standpoint, it's the internal intercostal and abdominal muscles. So if we look at this cross section of what are the rib cages, here's the sternum right here. If we look at the muscles themselves and we go ahead and go, here are the intercostal muscles, if we take that and break it out over to, here's intercostal, meaning in between the ribs. You have the innermost intercostal, and then you have internal and external intercostal muscles. And notice how they attach to the ribs. And when you inhale and exhale, your ribs do articulate a little bit, and they articulate, and forceful contraction comes from these guys being activated. Passive contraction happens from the diaphragm. And you'll see, like when you're huffing and puffing, you're really exhaling, and a lot of that work comes from the muscles that are in between the ribs to help push air out. So with lung volumes, we use a term called spirometry, and it's used to evaluate lung volumes, both at rest and at work. And it measures the amount and also the speed of air that's inhaled and exhaled. You have a couple components that you'll probably be asked on, no doubt about it. You have this total lung capacity that it's the total amount of volume of air that your lungs can move. And with the lungs themselves, your normal breathing will be your tidal volume, and what's left over after a big breath outside of tidal volume will be the residual volume. And there's functional residual capacity, meaning how much is left over just after normal tidal volume. So it's a lot of complex little terms, and hopefully we can get through a few of these here, but I can tell you probably the best thing to do is just read this section of the book over and over and over again, because it's a lot to read through. But what you'll see is you'll have total lung capacity here to the right, and then you have vital capacity. And when we are at rest, we have normal tidal volume. When we start to work out, and if we're at a pretty maximal effort, we'll be at vital capacity. Notice how much in volume we have in liters of oxygen being pulled into the lungs and out. And notice this though, it doesn't fully envelop or take over total lung capacity. There's still some residual volume left over, right? So with residual volume, you have to look at it in terms of when you're working out and you have increased volume of air being sucked in and blown out. When you forcefully blow out all your air, that's what's residual volume when you're working out. When you're just kind of sitting around and you try to blow out all your air, the difference between your tidal volume and total lung capacity is the functional residual capacity. So a couple quirky little terms here that you have to be able to differentiate. I'm sorry that they're kind of challenging, but you just have to kind of look at this chart and do the math on it and not even stress too much about like the actual numbers, but just understand that tidal volume is this. When we start to actually work out, we get closer to that vital capacity. When we exhale, you're always going to have some air left over in your lungs. That's the residual volume that's left over in your lungs. And so even though you might have a total lung capacity of 6.8 liters, when you fully exhale out, you still have some leftover air in your lungs. So those are the kind of things you have to think through while you're looking at this chart, and just kind of think through the breathing mechanics you have when you're either at rest or working out. So let's try to really refine this, so it makes a little bit of sense. So tidal volume is the amount of air moving in and out of the lungs at rest. So as I'm talking, actually, I'm not at rest. I'm doing some stuff. I'm gesticulating. I'm moving around a little bit. So I would be at total rest. But this would be very much an analogy of me at rest. Just normal tidal volume, in, out, in, out. And my conversational tone and the lecture I'm providing actually changes that tidal volume a little bit. But if I were sitting at rest, that would be tidal volume. Vital capacity is the amount of air a person can exhale after maximal inhalation. So I've inhaled, I've sucked in a bunch of air. I try to suck out as much air as possible. That's vital capacity. So I take a big gulp of air and I'm trying to blow out as much as possible. The total volume that can be moved in or out of the lungs during a deep breath. And that is a real easy and refined way to remember it. And once you've fully exhaled, the amount of air that's left over is residual volume, which is down here. So hopefully that helps kind of tighten it up a little bit. I know it's a bunch of terminology coming at you. You just got to learn it. I'm sorry to say. Gas exchange. The alveoli or alveolus are covered with capillaries. So you have these capillaries that allow for the oxygen exchange. So you have even a red line and a blue line here. And you can see right in here, you can see the difference right across the little bulbs, right? And that membrane right there, which is represented here, and then even represented here to a bigger degree, or more microscopic degree, if you will, gives you an idea of the teeny tiny size of this, but the alveolar exchange that happens. And they're covered with these capillaries that allow for, or are the site of gas exchange, both CO2 and O2. And that's referred to as diffusion. When you diffuse across a membrane, you have O2 going across the membrane in one direction, CO2 going across the membrane in the other direction, and there has to be a pressure gradient for that to happen. And we talked about that partial pressure before in terms of when the blood comes out of the heart at the aorta, it's at its highest blood pressure, but it's also at its highest partial pressure of oxygen. And as it moves through the system, it goes from a higher partial pressure of oxygen to a lower partial pressure of oxygen. So thinking back to our four tops and our hemis, our hemoglobin at that point probably is well saturated. We've had, one oxygen molecule hopped on, which allowed the permeability for the other three to kind of fulfill and fill in the four hemis. The four ions are interacting with the four oxygen molecules. And then as a result, we have a higher partial pressure of oxygen represented here as P of O2, PO2, and then PCO2. Now notice what happens here. As we leave the lung, we've got pulmonary vein that goes to the heart. Goes to the heart, we have a partial pressure of oxygen of 100, partial pressure of CO2 of 40, goes to the left atrium and left ventricle, gets squished out to the rest of the body, goes to the system or the systemic arteries, and you have partial pressure 100, partial pressure of CO2 of 40 over here. And as it goes to the muscles, you have this O2, because of the high partial pressure, is jumping off the red line. And as that happens, the CO2 is now able to jump on, causing the blue line. So once we have this exchange at a muscular level, we go to the systemic or the far-reaching vascular system, the veins, and the partial pressure of oxygen went from 100 to 40, and the partial pressure of CO2 went from 40 to 46. As we make our way back to the heart through the inferior and superior vena cava, we go into the right atrium and right ventricle, and then off we go to the lungs. And then we have the alveolar exchange, where we offload CO2, we onload oxygen, and then we go back to our 140 to repeat the cycle yet again. And so this is all about a pressure gradient on the oxygen side and the CO2 side, with the diffusion happening at the muscular level, right? As oxygen hops off and CO2 hops on. And also you have it at the alveolar level, where CO2 jumps off and then oxygen jumps on over and over and over. So with oxygen uptake, it's the amount of oxygen that's used by the tissues in the body. And you're going to have to look at some of these equations here and just kind of memorize them. It's really related to the ability of the heart and circulatory system to transport oxygen to the tissues at 100 partial pressure, P of O2, and then be able to offload to the muscles. And the body itself gets really good and efficient at pulling the oxygen off, especially when you've trained for it. And the equation that they always talk about is the Fick equation, which is this guy right here, which is the, if you look at the oxygen uptake by cardiac output by the AVO2, that's the difference between atrial and ventricular oxygen levels. And the AVO2 difference, we'll talk about, it's just that difference that we saw on the previous slide, where you have AVO2, where it's 100 versus 40. So you have this mathematical equation that can be deduced from the partial pressure of oxygen going out versus the partial pressure of oxygen coming back in, to help us through the Fick equation to determine how efficient and how much oxygen uptake there is in the muscles. Now, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and take some time and try to review this and really dig into it. But, we talk about this diastolic and systolic volumes. What they get into is heart rate, and you have N diastolic volumes and N systolic volumes times the AVO2 diff. That's a little bit to wrap your brain around, but you're not going to be asked too much about it in this class. But I can tell you, you start looking at the pressure of the blood pressure itself, and then you start looking at the partial pressure, and you start to notice that there are some things that are kind of congruent between those. But I just want to point out, you look at these respectively, that you have the pressure gradient that happens, and it's the same process when you start talking diffusion. It's just oxygen's hopping off in one part, the CO2 hopping on, and then when you get all the way around and you have a higher partial pressure of CO2 is hopping off, and then oxygen is hopping on over and over and over again. All right, guys, signing off. Hope that helps. I'm going to try to get these new slides updated for you, and I'm moving on to the next chapter.